Imagine stepping out into a Montana morning in 1886, where the wind cuts through you like a knife even in September, and there, in the middle of the Milk River Valley, stands this Norwegian guy named Anders Bjornstad, fresh off the boat from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia, hammering away at what looks like the most ridiculous cabin UVA ever seen. Not just one set of sturdy log walls, like everyone else builds to keep out the wolves and the weather, but two whole walls, one inside the other, with this weird gap in between that he's stuffing full of sawdust, moss, and clay like he's packing a lunch for a bear. Now, picture the local frontiersmen, tough as nails after years of scraping by on this harsh land, gathering around with their coffee and their chuckles, shaking their heads, because to them, this is pure foolishness, a waste of good timber and precious time when winter's already whispering threats from the north, and they rebetting their last dollar that this newcomer will come crawling to their bunkhouses before the first real snow sticks. But hold on, because what if this crazy idea wasn't just some immigrant's whim, but a secret weapon forged in centuries of surviving nights so cold they'd freeze your thoughts midst? Let's dive into this true tale from the American frontier, where one man's mocked invention didn't just save his skin, but changed how people thought about beating Mother Nature at her cruelest game. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll see why dismissing old-world wisdom can cost you more than just pride. Anders Bjornstad wasn't your typical settler. He arrived in Montana Territory about 18 months earlier, in 1885, carrying nothing but his carpenter's tools, a head full of knowledge from the good Brandel Valley back home, where winters routinely plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and a determination to carve out a life in this vast, unforgiving landscape that promised opportunity but delivered mostly hardship. With blizzards that could bury a man alive and temperatures that tested the limits of human endurance. Back in Norway, folks had learned the hard way over generations that single-wall cabins were death traps. Sure, they kept out the rain, but come deep winter, the cold seeped right through like water through a sieve, forcing families to huddle by the fire all night, feeding it log after log just to avoid freezing in their sleep. And too many stories ended with folks not waking up at all because the heat vanished as soon as the flames died down. So Anders, drawing from that brutal heritage, decided to build smarter, not harder. He picked a spot on a gentle southern slope, shielded by cottonwoods from the howling north winds, and started felling lodgepole pines, 42 of them in total, way more than the 25 or so his neighbors used for their standard 16 by 20-foot shacks. He laid the outer wall first, solid 6-inch logs, notched tight, then stepped inside and built another wall parallel to it, leaving a 6-inch void that he meticulously filled layer by layer with that insulating mix. Sawdust from the local mill for bulk, dried moss from the riverbank to trap air pockets, and clay dug from a deposit a couple miles east to bind it all and prevent settling or moisture buildup, because he knew from experience that any gaps would create thermal bridges. Basically highways for the cold to sneak in and steal your warmth. The locals couldn't wrap their heads around it. Take John Weather, the valley's go-to master carpenter with a dozen Montana winters under his belt, who sauntered over one crisp afternoon and outright laughed, pointing out how this double-wall nonsense added 40% more timber and 3 extra weeks of back-breaking labor, time that could be spent hunting or fortifying against the inevitable storms. And he warned Anders that the dead space in between would just let heat escape faster, dooming him to burn through firewood like a prairie fire through dry grass. Then there was Samuel Grant, the big ranch owner who survived 19 winters out here and employed half the men in the valley. He did the math right there on a scrap of paper, figuring a regular cabin chewed up 1 cord of wood per week in the depths of winter. But this abomination, he'd need 4 cords, easy, and with wood scarce enough already. Grant slapped down a bet with the boys at the saloon that Anders would abandon ship within 2 weeks of the first heavy snow. Maybe even beg for a spot in Grant's warm bunkhouse when the mercury dropped. Whispers spread like wildfire. Folks called it the Fool's Fortress, joking that Anders was building a cabin for ghosts, or maybe just to hide his embarrassment when it failed spectacularly. And even the women folks shook their heads while mending clothes, wondering if this quiet Norwegian with his strange accent had lost his mind crossing the ocean. But Anders just smiled politely, explaining in his broken English how back home, this design let a fire's heat linger for 6 to 8 hours after banking it for the night, compared to the measly 2 or 3 in a single-wall setup, meaning better sleep, less wood chopping in the dark, and a real shot at comfort in hellish conditions. Still, no one listened, too set in their ways from years of proven frontier building that prioritized speed over smarts. By late October, as the first frosts painted the ground white and the cabin stood complete, cozy on the inside with its inner walls radiating steady warmth from a test, Farrinder settled. stacking his woodpile neat and watching the valley brace for what old-timers were already calling a rough season ahead. With early signs of heavier snowfall than usual, the mocking didn't stop. If anything, it ramped up as November brought nighttime dips to 15 degrees. Then 10, then 5, and Anders's chimney puffed less smoke than anyone else's, which weathered chalked up to the poor guy being too stubborn or too cold to keep a proper blaze going. But inside that double-wall haven, something magical was happening. The outer logs took the brunt of the freeze. The filled cavity acted like a blanket, smothering any heat loss. And the inner wall held on to the fire's glow like a lover's embrace, keeping things toasty with half the fuel his doubters burned through. Whispers turned to side-eye glances as folks noticed Anders chopping less wood, venturing out less often in the chill. But no one admitted doubt yet, not with the real winter still lurking on the horizon. And as December loomed with its promise of deeper snows and sharper winds, the question hung in the icy air. What if this wasteful cabin was Uintay joke after all? But the key to surviving whatever brutal twist the skies had in store. Stick around, because the coldest winter in half a century was about to test everything and everyone, in ways they'd never forget, as the calendar flipped to December 1886. The Milk River Valley hunkered down under blankets of snow that came earlier and thicker than anyone could remember, with flurries turning to drifts that swallowed fence posts whole and forced ranch hands like Samuel Granta's crew to dig paths just to reach the barns, while families stockpiled what little they had dried meat, root vegetables, and cords of splitwood stacked high against the inevitable siege of cold that defined life on the frontier. But amid all this preparation, Anders Bjornsted's double-wall cabin stood like a quiet sentinel on its rise, its chimneys sending up thin, steady wisps that drew more curious stares than ever. Because while neighbors were already firing up their stoves round the clock to combat the dropping temperatures, Anders seemed almost nonchalant, emerging bundled but unhurried to tend his small herd or fetch water from the unfrozen spring nearby. And it wasn't long before the mocking turned sharper, with John Wetherb cornering him at the trading post to declare that cavity between the walls a moisture trap waiting to rot the whole thing from the inside out, predicting mildew and collapse by spring if the freeze didn't claim him first. Life in those single-wall cabins was no picnic. Take Wetherb's own place. A solid build by local standards with 8-inch logs chinked tight with mud and moss. But as the mercury dipped to 0 and below, the cold clawed its way in through every crack, forcing him and his wife to pile on quilts and keep the fire roaring every couple hours through the night, their breath fogging the air even indoors where temperatures hovered around 45 degrees on a good day. And out on Grant's ranch, the big house fared little better, despite its size burning through half a quart a day just to keep the main room bearable, with the outer rooms abandoned to the frost that coated walls like a ghostly paint. Folks shared stories around potluck fires about past winters, like the one in '82 that claimed Old Man Harlow's toast to frostbite, or '75 when a blizzard trapped the Millers for a week with nothing but cornmeal mush. But this year felt different, with the air carrying a bite that veterans swore hinted at something biblical. And sure enough, by mid-December, storms rolled in like angry gods, dumping feet of snow and whipping winds that howled through the valley, testing every structure and soul within it. Anders, though, reported none of the usual woes. His designist genius lay in the physics he de-inherited from Norwegian forebears. The outer wall buffered the gale's fury. The insulated gap created a thermal barrier that slowed heat escape to a crawl. And the inner wall, warmed by a modest fire, distributed that heat evenly, maintaining 60 degrees or better with just a quarter-cord weekly burn rate, letting him sleep soundly without the constant vigil his neighbors endured, and even bake bread without the dough freezing. Madraza doubters doubled down, organizing a welfare visit disguised as neighborly concern right after Christmas, when a lull in the weather allowed a group led by Grant to ride up unannounced, expecting to find Anders shivering and desperate, maybe ready to concede defeat and join their tried-and-true ways. Instead, they were greeted at the door by a man in shirt sleeves, offering hot coffee from a pot that hadn't needed constant tending. And as they stepped inside to the surprising warmth 62 degrees, by Anders's mercury thermometer, no icy drafts sneaking under doors, or through windows they masked their shock with gruff questions about how he was freezing his fool head off. Anders patiently explained the science in simple terms. Befill in the walls, trapped tiny air pockets that acted like millions of little insulators, resisting the cold's advance, much like a thick wool coat over a thin one beats a single layer every time. And he shared tales from home, where single walls led to needless deaths, thicker walls reduced suffering but still demanded endless fuel, and double walls finally brought true livability, cutting wood use in half and letting folks focus on thriving, not just surviving. Grant harumphed about foreign tricks not suited to American soil, and Weatherb nitpicked the extra cost in logs. But as they rode away, seeds of doubt sprouted. Why was Anders's woodpile barely touched while theirs dwindled alarmingly? And how come his cabin showed no frost on the inside walls when theirs glistened with it every morning? January crept in with deceptive calm, temperatures holding at -15. Tough, but tolerable for seasoned frontiersmen who prided themselves on grit. But whispers from Fort Assiniboine spoke of barometers dropping and skies darkening in ways that screamed trouble. And as the valley braced for what might come, Anders quietly reinforced his roof against snowload, confident in his build but wary of the unknown. Little did anyone know, the real monster was barreling down from the Arctic cold snap so vicious, it would rewrite survival rules and turn mockers into believers overnight. But would it be too late for some? Hang on, because the heart of this winter's fury is about to unleash hell, and only one cabin was ready for it. The night of January 12, 1887, hit the Milk River Valley like a hammer from the heavens. With temperatures plummeting to an official -38 degrees at nearby Fort Assiniboine, unofficially dipping to -42 in the shadowed lowlands, where the cold pooled like deadly water and for 6 straight days. The mercury refused to climb above turning the world into a frozen nightmare where exposed skin burned in minutes, livestock perished in huddles against barn walls, and wells froze solid, forcing folks to melt snow for every drop of water while battling winds that screamed through any unsealed crevice like banshees on the hunt. This was the infamous hard winter of 1886–87, the coldest in 50 years. Later dubbed the Great DOP for the millions of cattle it claimed across the plains, a catastrophe that bankrupted ranches and drove settlers to despair. But in the midst of this Arctic apocalypse, Anders Bornsted's double-wall cabin became a beacon of improbable comfort. Its inner sanctum holding steady at 68 degrees in the center and 62 near the edges, with just a small fire banked low, burning through a mere 3/4 of a cord over the entire ordeal, 300% more efficient than the frantic fueling his neighbors endured. Chaos reigned in the conventional cabins. John Weatherb, ever the proud builder, found himself waking every 45 minutes to stoke his blaze, his interior barely scraping 43 to 48 degrees. With walls slicked in hoarfrost that dripped when the fire peaked, and his family rotated sleeping spots to stay near the heat source, exhaustion etching lines on their faces as they burned furniture scraps when the wood ran low. Over at Samuel Grant's ranch, the situation turned dire. Triple the usual fuel consumption just to keep pipes from bursting. With hand-splitting frozen logs in the dark and 3 elderly settlers staggering in for refuge. One family even confining themselves to a single room for 48 hours. Huddling under every blanket they owned while the cold claimed toes and fingers valley-wide. Welfare riders braved a whiteout on January 18th as the thaw finally teased, checking homesteads and finding tailies of woe-frozen food stores, burst water barrels, and a few tragic losses to exposure. But when they reached Anders's place, the light smoke curling from his chimney raised eyebrows, and upon knocking, he answered in a single wool shirt, calm as a summer day, insisting he needed no aid and inviting them in to see for themselves how the double walls had performed like a fortress, shielding the outer layer from the worst, while the insulated core preserved every bit of warmth, allowing him to read by lamplight, mend tools, and even host a neighbor's child who'd wandered over in the storm. Word spread like melting snow. By late January, as the valley licked its wounds, attitudes flipped. Grant, humbled, rode back to ask for blueprints, admitting his predictions were dead wrong and forking over $300 that summer to retrofit his ranch house. North and west sides with the double wall technique, slashing his fuel use by 48% the next winter and boasting about the steady comfort to anyone who'd listen. Weathered swallowing his pride, apprenticed under Anders for a week, learning to pack the fill without air pockets, and later preaching at a 1889 Territorial Builders Conference about the folly of dismissing immigrant innovations, urging folks to embrace knowledge from afar, because arrogance freezes faster than any wind. Within months, Anders had 7 contracts for new builds, in over 2 years. 17 cabins within 50 miles adopted the design, spreading to towns like Great Falls and Fort Benton by 1892, where surveys noted reduced winter mortality thanks to stable indoor temps that cut respiratory ills and let kids sleep without risk, saving families 6 to 9 cords of wood per season, that's weeks of labor spared for farming or family. Anders trained 6 apprentices for free between 1887 and 1892, honoring his Norwegian tradition of sharing survival smarts, and his original cabin endured, eventually donated to the Montana Historical Society as a testament to vernacular historical engineering that bridged old world wisdom with new frontier needs. standing strong until his death in 1904 at age 67. This story is just about beating the cold. It's a reminder that innovation often looks like madness until it saves the day. And in today's world of energy, crises and extreme weather, maybe we could learn from Anders's walls about building smarter for whatever storms come our way. If this tale of frontier grit and genius hooked you, hit that like button, subscribe for more hidden history gems, and drop a comment below. What's the craziest survival hack you've heard of? Let's keep the conversation warm.